The air in Gravely Parish, Louisiana, hung thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket woven from humidity, cotton dust, and the stench of slow-moving river water. It was the summer of 1907, and the Delta was an anvil under the sun, forging despair and sweat in equal measure. The tranquility of the landscape was a cruel deception, masking the rot underneath, a rot that had finally surfaced with a terrifying finality. Detective Elias Vance stepped off the train, his polished leather shoes instantly coated in the fine red dust of the region. He felt the immediate silent scrutiny of the few locals lingering by the depot, a mix of tired-looking field hands and men in ill-fitting suits, their faces etched with suspicion and exhaustion. Vance, a man of sharp, city-tailored suits and a gaze too focused for the countryside, felt immediately out of place. He carried his past like a heavy satchel, and the move from the bustling streets of New Orleans to this forgotten corner was less a promotion and more a quiet banishment after a case that had gone tragically sideways. The reason for his presence was grimly clear: the Cottonfield scream killers. 2 bodies in 3 weeks. Both victims, young men, sharecroppers, found deep in the endless, shimmering rows of cotton. The details, which had filtered to the city desks and caused a small, contained panic, were chilling. The victims hadn't just been murdered. They had been subjected to a methodical, cold brutality, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute, soundless terror. The local sheriff's department, small and overwhelmed, had been quick to call for outside help, desperate to quell the growing panic that threatened to halt the crucial cotton harvest. Vance found Sheriff Dale leaning against a mud-splattered Ford Model T, a man whose uniform looked 2 sizes too small and whose face was a roadmap of worry lines. "Detective Vance," the sheriff said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. He didn't offer his hand, opting instead to wipe his brow with a grimy handkerchief. "Heard you're the best the city could spare. We need it. Folks are jumpy as rabbits in a wildfire." "Sheriff," Vance replied, his voice calm and measured, a stark contrast to the Delta's frantic energy. "Start with the latest scene. I want to see exactly what you saw, and tell me what the people are saying. Rumors are often the purest form of fear." As they drove, the scenery was a hypnotic blur of cotton fields stretching to the horizon, the air conditioning non-existent, allowing the heat to press in. The road was barely more than packed earth, and the vehicle bounced violently. "They're not saying much to me," Sheriff Dale admitted, wrestling with the steering wheel. "Mostly whispers about something not right, something methodical. The first one, Jesse, he was found on the O'Connell land. The second, Caleb, over at the Blackwell farm. They're miles apart, but the killing, it was the same." "Same how?" Vance pressed, his eyes scanning the endless fields, the perfect hiding place and the perfect hunting ground. The silence between the rows seemed to vibrate with untold secrets. "The screams," the sheriff said, dropping his voice to a near whisper. "That's why they got that name. Folks heard the screams, long drawn-out wails piercing the night. But when they got there, nothing. Just the cicadas and the cotton stalks swaying. The body, it was quiet." Vance pulled out his notebook, its clean pages a canvas for the coming horror. "And the signature, the symbols. Tell me about those." "Strange marks," the sheriff grunted, stopping the car abruptly by a makeshift police barrier, a rope strung between 2 posts. Carved right into the ground near the body. They looked like farm implements maybe, a broken scythe, a pair of calipers. Nothing mystical, just unsettling. They walked the final 100 yards through the oppressive stillness of the cotton field. The plants, tall and dense, seemed to lean in, observing them. The sun beat down, turning the air hazy and the ground baking hot. The crime scene, though mostly cleaned, still held the heavy scent of copper and decay, a phantom residue of violence. "He was found right here." The sheriff indicated a patch of disturbed earth. "Look, detective, I've seen some brutal things, but this had a kind of focus to it, like the killer was working, not raging, working." Vance knelt, ignoring the dust and the heat. He focused not on the space where the body was, but the subtle depressions in the surrounding earth. He noticed a slight, almost imperceptible pattern in the way the cotton stalks were bent, a subtle path of entry and exit. The sheriff's men had focused on the obvious. Vance focused on the deliberate. He used the field, Vance observed, his voice barely audible. He knows the rouse. He knows the silence. He didn't just dump the body here. He composed the scene. The symbols are a secondary display. The murder itself is the primary. He stood up, his gaze distant, already piecing together the psychology of the unseen man. This wasn't a crime of passion or convenience. It was a calculated, sustained act, designed to generate maximum psychological terror in a community already frayed by hardship. The screams, the silence, the meticulous mutilation, it was a performance. "Sheriff," Vance said, turning, his eyes locked on the worried man. "Get me the personal effects of both victims, anything they carried. I want to know who they talked to, who hated them, and who they owed. This is a human drama, not a ghost story. And humans leave traces." The sun began to dip, painting the delta sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, a deceptively beautiful backdrop for the horror. The distant lonely sound of a train whistle seemed to mourn the victims. Vance knew, deep in his gut, that the killer was still out there, hiding in plain sight, already planning the third act of his gruesome spectacle. The fear was a palpable thing, growing stronger with every silent, cotton-dusted evening. Vance looked directly into the camera. "The truth is buried deep in the delta dust. Don't miss what happens next. Click that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't lose the thread of this mystery. I need to know who's watching." The first night in Gravely Parish would be long, hot, and filled with the ghosts of screams no one could explain. The case had just begun to pull him into its suffocating depths. Detective Elias Vance spent the next day immersed in the oppressive heat and the even more oppressive silence of Gravely Parish. The sheriff's office was a cramped, airless room above the general store, smelling faintly of old coffee and unprocessed fear. Vance had spread out the few belongings recovered from the victims, Jesse and Caleb, on a scarred wooden table. Jesse had been carrying a tattered photo of a woman and 2 young children, a tobacco pouch, and a worn leather Bible. Caleb's pockets held a few dollars, a cheap pocket knife, and a small, crudely carved wooden bird, a dove perhaps. They were just workers, Sheriff Dale muttered, leaning in the doorway, chewing slowly on a toothpick. No enemies to speak of, kept to themselves. Hard lives, just trying to make it to the next season. Vance didn't look up. "No one lives without enemies, Sheriff. Not in a place this hot, this close. There are grudges over land, over debts, over a woman. This killer isn't a random vagrant. He's operating with an intimate knowledge of the area and his targets." Vance picked up the small, wooden dove. It was a detail too personal to ignore. "Who carved this, Sheriff? Did Caleb make it? Did he receive it?" The sheriff frowned, spitting the toothpick onto the floor. "Probably bought it. Some old man down by the river makes those things, sells them cheap." Vance secured the dove in an evidence bag. "Let's talk about the screams. You said they were loud, long, and then silence. Did anyone hear the approach? The struggle?" "No, sir. Just the noise itself. Folks said it cut right through the cicadas, high and terrible, like someone being flayed alive by sound. But by the time anyone got close, nothing. Just the wind." Vance paced the small room. He looked at the map of the parish, a hand-drawn sketch detailing the cotton farms and the winding bayous. The 2 murder sites, O'Connell Land and Blackwell Farm, were separated by several miles, connected primarily by back roads and, crucially, a network of dried-up creek beds that offered concealed travel. "This is key, Sheriff. The victims were found after the screams, and the killer left those symbols." Vance tapped the location markers on the map. "I need detailed photographs of those carvings. The killer is communicating, but not in words." Later that afternoon, Vance drove the dusty roads alone, feeling the profound isolation of the Delta. He stopped at the general store, a hub of hushed gossip and anxious eyes. He bought a warm bottle of soda and observed. The tension was palpable. Every glance lingered a moment too long. Every laugh was brittle. He approached the owner, a woman named Martha, whose face looked permanently etched with worry. "Ma'am," Vance said, his voice polite but insistent. "I'm the detective from the city. I need to know about Jesse and Caleb. Were they close? Did they have any habits? Anything out of the ordinary?" Martha wrung her apron nervously. They were quiet boys, worked hard. "But detective, there's something you need to understand about this place. We don't talk to strangers. We don't talk to police. We survive by keeping our own counsel. Survival is about to become difficult, Martha," Vance countered gently. "This man will kill again. He's telling you that with every silent body he leaves in the fields. Someone knows something. Who was seen around the Blackwell place recently? A stranger? A disgruntled former worker?" Martha hesitated, her eyes darting to a large, silent man standing near the canned goods, arms crossed. Suspicion. It was a currency here, paid out in sidelong glances. "There was a man," Martha finally whispered, leaning closer. "A surveyor. Came through a few months back. Said he was mapping the old flood zones for the railroad. He was odd, too quiet. Had that city look, like you. Didn't fit in the cotton dust." "A surveyor," Vance repeated, his mind racing. "A professional, transient, with knowledge of maps and terrain. A perfect cover. Did he leave a name?" "He did," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "He boarded with the O'Connells for a while. Said his name was Mr. Finch." Vance knew the name might be an alias, but the detail was a thread, a tangible lead in a suffocating web of silence. The killer was methodical, meticulous, and hid behind a respectable facade. As Vance prepared to leave, the large man by the canned goods stepped forward, his eyes hard and unyielding. "You stirring up trouble, detective. Some things in the Delta are best left alone. They got their own way of settling." Vance met the man's gaze directly. "The way things are settling now is with a shovel, sir. I'm here to change that. If you know something, the silence makes you complicit." The man backed down, but the message was clear. Cooperation was not a guarantee. The town was closing ranks, protecting secrets more dangerous than the killer himself. Driving back to the sheriff's office, Vance felt the heavy psychological weight of the place. The environment itself was an accomplice to the crime. The flat, featureless fields, the suffocating heat, the profound isolation. It all fostered an atmosphere where a rational man could slip into madness, and a killer could operate with impunity. He realized the true horror wasn't just the death. It was the fact that the community knew the killer was one of them, or at least someone who walked among them, and their fear had compelled them into a paralyzing silence. Vance wasn't just hunting a killer. He was fighting the complicity of an entire parish. He needed to find Mr. Finch. The mention of Mr. Finch, the quiet, transient surveyor, gave Detective Vance his first solid direction. He pressed Sheriff Dale for any records of the man, knowing full well that in 1907 Gravely Parish, official documentation for a temporary worker would be scarce. "He never filed anything official," the sheriff confirmed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "He just showed up. Said he was working for a New Orleans firm looking at a potential rail spur expansion. Nobody questioned it much. Surveyors come and go." "A rail spur expansion gives him two things, Sheriff," Vance explained, sketching a quick diagram on the map. "Access and a plausible reason to be studying the terrain, the back roads, and the movement of people. It gives him time to select his victims and his kill sites." Vance decided to go to the O'Connell farm, where Finch had reportedly boarded. The farm was a desolate, sun-bleached property. The O'Connells, an elderly couple, were hesitant and terrified, their fear manifesting as a chilling, unblinking stillness. "He was polite," Mrs. O'Connell whispered, her hands twisting her apron. "Always quiet. Kept to himself. said he needed the silence for his precise calculations. Did he have any peculiar habits? Anything that struck you as unusual, beyond his city clothes? Vance asked, his eyes scanning the dusty parlor. Mr. O'Connell finally spoke, his voice dry and fragile. He never used the outhouse during the day. Said the sun bothered him, always went out late after midnight, and he always carried a heavy leather satchel, never let it leave his side, even at supper. Vance's interest sharpened. A satchel heavy enough to warrant constant attention, used by a man who moved stealthily at night. Instruments, not just surveying equipment, but perhaps the tools of the killer's trade, the tools used to create the meticulously carved symbols and to inflict the chilling wounds. Did he ever talk about Jesse or Caleb? No, Mrs. O'Connell said quickly. He didn't talk much about anything local. He was always looking at maps, drawing lines, seemed more interested in the boundaries than the people. Vance thanked them, his mind now fixed on Finch's possible motive, boundaries and precision. The killer had left symbols that resembled modified tools, a pair of calipers, a segmented circle. These were the hallmarks of a man obsessed with measurement and delineation. He drove to the site where Jesse's body was found, less than a mile from the O'Connell farm. This time, Vance didn't look at the field. He looked at the boundary line between the O'Connell land and the adjacent property. Kneeling down, Vance used a small trowel to scrape away the top layer of sun-baked earth near the property marker. A faint, almost invisible straight line had been scored deeply into the clay beneath the dust, a surveying mark, meticulously drawn. But running parallel to it was a series of small, shallow, circular indentations. "Sheriff, look at this," Vance called, pointing to the impressions. "This isn't a symbol left for effect. This is a measurement guide." The killer was using the victim's location as a precise point in some kind of grid. He's not just killing, he's mapping his actions. The realization was a punch to the gut. The killer wasn't targeting the men for personal reasons. He was targeting their location on a perverse, carefully crafted map. The victims were simply coordinates. That night, Vance sat alone in the stifling heat of his rented room, the gas lamp flickering, casting long, nervous shadows. He reconstructed a profile. Mr. Finch, a man obsessed with order, precision, and boundaries. Someone who saw people as temporary fixtures disrupting a perfect geometry. The screams were the signature, the final note in a perfectly calculated ritual. He pulled out the notes on the symbols again, the segmented circle, the scythe, the calipers. They weren't mystical, they were tools of calculation, harvest, and measurement. A loud, sudden sound outside startled him, a dog howling, long and mournful, immediately silenced by a sharp, cracking sound that might have been a gunshot or a heavy slamming door. The absolute silence that followed was worse than the noise. Vance checked his watch. 1:45 a.m. The time Mr. O'Connell said Finch would venture out. A sudden, horrifying thought struck him. Finch had been investigating the old flood zones. Flood zones are defined by elevation and distance. If the killer was mapping his murders, was he establishing a macabre boundary based on a calculated natural line? Vance rushed out, leaving the lamp burning. He had to find that surveyor's satchel. It would contain the map, the instruments, and the entire sick blueprint of the Cottonfield scream killers. The oppressive darkness of the Delta pressed in, thick and absolute, concealing everything. The chilling possibility that the murders were geographically calculated rather than personally motivated galvanized Detective Vance. He knew Finch wouldn't have gone far. A man so reliant on precision would stick close to his area of interest. The next morning, Vance and Sheriff Dale began a quiet, methodical search of the abandoned properties near the O'Connell and Blackwell farms, focusing on any structure that could offer solitude and shelter. They drove down a barely visible track, bordering the old, dried-up Bayou St. Clair, the air thick with the smell of stagnant water and decaying leaves. They found it on the old Patterson place, a small, dilapidated cabin, half hidden by overgrown cypress trees. The windows were boarded up, and a tattered sign warned of trespassing, barely visible through the choking kudzu vines. Inside, the cabin was mostly empty, save for a thin layer of dust and the nesting of small animals. But in the center of the main room, set up on 2 wooden crates, was a makeshift drafting table. Vance approached it carefully. Sprawled across the table was a large, detailed map of Gravely Parish. It was not a railroad survey map. It was an obsessively detailed topographical chart marked with dozens of precise, tiny notations, mostly relating to elevation changes and historical waterlines. "Look at this, Sheriff," Vance pointed. "The O'Connell and Blackwell farms. They are marked with an X, but the X is not where the farms are. It's where the bodies were found." The 2 murder sites were connected on the map by a faint, continuous line drawn in red pencil. This line followed an old, forgotten boundary, the 10-foot elevation line above the Bayou St. Clair. "He's marking the murders along an elevation contour," Vance breathed out, a grim understanding dawning. "He's establishing a perpendicular boundary to the natural waterline. The cotton fields are flat, but this line is his personal meridian. The victims are anchors in his demented geometric plane." Hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the table, Vance found the killer's missing satchel. It was heavy, just as the O'Connells had described. Inside, the contents were horrifyingly specific. A specialized drafting compass with a sharpened point, a set of fine surgical scalpels, not for surgery, but for precision carving, and a small leather-bound journal. Vance opened the journal. The entries weren't typical diary musings. They were cold, detached, mathematical observations. Entry 1. "Disorder is the enemy of all creation. The human element disrupts the perfection of the plane. They are noise. Noise must be silenced." Entry 5. "The first anchor placed. Coordinates 30 degrees 12E, N 91 degrees 45, W. The scream was necessary. It defines the boundary of the noise that is to be expunged. The field is clean now." Entry 11. "The second anchor confirms the line. The geometry is sound. The elevation must be respected. The symbols are the signature of the craftsman, the proof of the precision. I am the surveyor of order." The terror was purely psychological, the work of a deeply disturbed mind operating with absolute, cold-blooded logic. He wasn't killing for rage or passion. He was killing to satisfy a need for mathematical perfection. "He talks about a third anchor," Sheriff Dale whispered, his face pale, pointing at the last entry on the map, a marked location along the same 10-foot elevation line, approximately 5 miles downriver, near the small, isolated community of Three Forks Bend. "He's operating on a schedule, Sheriff," Vance said, snapping the journal shut. "He completes his boundary with 3 points. We have to get to Three Forks Bend. Now." As they prepared to leave, Vance noticed a final, chilling detail on the drafting table. The map was annotated in the margins with a name, D. Finch. "D. Finch," Vance said aloud. "This isn't a random man, a man with this precision, this focus. He has a history. Sheriff, get a wire sent to New Orleans. Any record of a D. Finch surveyor. Anywhere. We need a face, an address, a real name." They sped toward Three Forks Bend, the dust churning behind the Model T. The isolation of the Delta felt like a tightening noose. They were racing against a killer who had already calculated their reaction time. They pulled into Three Forks Bend just as the sun began its brutal descent. The small community, even more sparse than Gravely Parish, was quiet. Too quiet. Vance felt the air vibrating with the same pre-murder tension he had sensed before. The killer was close. He had to move faster than the killer's geometry. He had to disrupt the calculus of death. The race was on to prevent the final, terrifying anchor from being placed. The village of Three Forks Bend was little more than a cluster of 3 shacks, a dilapidated store, and a small abandoned church, all clinging to the edge of the cotton fields where the bayou split. The isolation here was absolute, magnifying the sense of danger. Vance and Sheriff Dale quickly engaged the few residents, an elderly, reclusive family, the Hendersons, who rarely left their property. They were hesitant, deeply distrustful of law enforcement, but the threat of a third murder was enough to break their reserve. "Yes, we've seen him," Mr. Henderson said, his eyes watering in the dust. "The man with the case. He's been around for days, measuring the fields." "Where is he now?" Vance demanded, his voice sharp. "He's been staying in the old church," Mrs. Henderson offered, pointing a trembling finger toward the small wooden structure. "Says it's the only place quiet enough for his figures." Vance and the sheriff approached the church, their movements slow and deliberate. The heat was starting to break, replaced by the heavy, humid stillness of twilight, the killer's preferred time. The church door was ajar, creaking rhythmically in the slight breeze. Vance drew his service revolver, the heavy, cold metal a comfort in the rising dread. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of dust and old wood. The altar was empty, but sitting on a pew, illuminated by the last rays of the dying sun filtering through a broken stained-glass window, was D. Finch. He was a man in his late 30s, slight, with neat, unremarkable features and precise, wire-rimmed glasses. He wasn't menacing. He was sterile. He was meticulously cleaning a drafting instrument with a small piece of cloth, completely calm, as if waiting for a business appointment. "Mr. Finch," Vance stated, his voice ringing in the empty church. "Detective Vance. We need to talk about Jesse and Caleb." Finch didn't flinch. He slowly placed the instrument down, looked up, and smiled. A small, unnerving twitch of the lips. Detective Vance, I rather thought you'd catch up eventually, though I did calculate for another day of movement. Your efficiency is slightly above the statistical mean for this parish." "The talking is over, Finch," Sheriff Dale growled, raising his old rifle. "You're under arrest for 2 counts of murder." Finch's smile widened, but his eyes remained utterly cold. "Murder, Sheriff? No. You mistake creation for destruction. I was restoring order, establishing the geometric perimeter of the necessary cleanliness. Those men were simply variables in the equation of this land. They were noise." "The screams, Finch," Vance pressed, trying to penetrate the mathematical shield. "Why the screams? Was that part of your calculation?" "Of course," Finch replied, his tone academic. The screams were the absolute expression of chaos, the maximum volume achieved just before the point of silence. It was the necessary calibration of the environment, the measure of their disorder, before I imposed my final, permanent order. Vance knew arresting him here would be easy, but the mystery of the case's scope and the psychological weight it had on the community had to be resolved completely. "You talk of 3 anchors, Finch. Where is the third victim?" Finch chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "The map is in the satchel, Detective. You saw the location. The third point is necessary to define the perfect line. Without it, the geometry is incomplete. The line must be straight." As he spoke, Finch slowly reached into the pocket of his vest. Vance and the sheriff tensed, prepared for resistance. Finch slowly pulled out a small, rolled piece of parchment. "I am a man of precision, Detective," Finch said, holding up the scroll. "I never rely on memory. I have secured the third variable." Vance took a careful step forward. "Who is it, Finch?" "It is a man who was interfering with the flow of the land," Finch replied, his eyes gleaming with mad logic. "A man who insisted on building his home too close to the flood zone, disrupting the natural line. A man whose fear has been loudest in this parish." Finch unfurled the parchment, which was not a map, but a detailed drawing. It was a precise, meticulous sketch of the face of Sheriff Dale. The sheriff's gasp filled the silent church. Finch hadn't been targeting a random victim at Three Forks Bend. He had calculated the disruptive force in his environment, the man who had the potential to stop his work. The final anchor was the sheriff himself. Finch didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for his glasses, taking them off and placing them delicately on the pew. "The line must be straight, detective." And now the geometry is perfect. He was completely unarmed, his control absolute. The arrest was anticlimactic, a mere formality. The true terror was the realization that Finch's victims were chosen not by malice, but by a cold mathematical dedication to a lunatic, self-imposed rule. He saw the world as a flawed chart that he was commissioned to fix. As they led Finch out, the killer looked at the surrounding cotton fields, the deepening shadows, and the suffocating isolation. "It is complete, detective. The parish is clean. The line has been drawn." The case was closed, but the psychological scars on Gravely Parish were just beginning to set in. The real mystery wasn't who the killer was, but the horrifying fact that he had succeeded in turning the natural landscape into a cold, meticulous blueprint for human terror. The capture of D. Finch should have brought immediate relief to Gravely Parish, but Detective Vance felt a profound unease settle over the Delta. Finch, now locked in the small iron-barred cell at the parish seat, remained eerily calm, discussing his geometry with the detached air of a scholar discussing obscure philosophy. The people, though outwardly relieved, began to turn their fear inward. The realization that the killer was a man of cold, deliberate calculation, a surveyor of death, rather than a madman driven by passion, fostered a terrifying new kind of paranoia. They looked at their neighbors, at the neat rows of cotton, and saw not their livelihood, but the potential for a calculated boundary. Vance spent the day examining the contents of Finch's satchel in detail. Beyond the scalpels and the compass, he found a small, meticulously organized file of documents. Receipts for specialized tools, train tickets from cities across the Midwest, and a single faded photograph. The photograph showed a younger Finch standing stiffly next to a man who looked remarkably similar, perhaps a father or older brother, both dressed in formal surveying attire, holding a brass transit. The elder man's face, however, held a distinct look of disappointment and severity. "This is the key, Sheriff," Vance said, tapping the photo. "Finch isn't just self-taught. This obsession with precision, with order, comes from somewhere. Look at the elder man's posture. He's rigid, demanding. I'd bet this is the origin of Finch's need for absolute perfection." A wire came back from New Orleans that evening. Daniel Finch was a certified, though disgraced, surveyor. He had been dismissed from a prominent New Orleans firm 5 years prior, after a disastrous project where his insistence on adhering to outdated, almost arbitrary, perfect lines caused a massive financial loss to his clients. He had been deemed unfit for professional employment due to his obsessive adherence to abstract mathematical ideals over practical reality. "Disgraced surveyor," Vance murmured. He lost his profession because of his obsession. The Delta, with its constantly shifting boundaries and its disorderly people, became his new project, a place where he could re-establish his own perverted sense of order. The trial preparations began immediately, but Vance's attention was drawn back to the most disturbing detail: the screams. If Finch was so calculated, why risk the noise? The screams were the only element that seemed out of his control, the only chaotic variable in his perfect equation. He revisited the O'Connell farm, speaking again to the old couple. "Mrs. O'Connell," Vance asked, his tone gentle, "when you heard the screams from Jesse's field, was it just one voice, or did it sound multi-layered?" She shuddered, the memory still fresh. "It was awful, Detective. It wasn't just a wail. It was too loud, too high and too low at the same time, like two people screaming, but it was just one sound." Vance drove to the church where Finch was captured, then out to the location Finch had marked as the third anchor, the area where he intended to kill Sheriff Dale. He searched the ground near the old church for any evidence Finch might have discarded. Hidden beneath a pile of loose lumber, he found a small, crudely fashioned wooden box. Inside the box were two things: a series of small, perforated wooden whistles, similar to those used by duck hunters, but meticulously designed with different apertures, and a short length of thin, strong catgut wire. A cold knot formed in Vance's stomach. Finch had addressed the problem of the screams not by suppressing them, but by manufacturing them. The screams were fake, Vance realized, the terrifying simplicity of the deception hitting him. Finch was a master of sensory manipulation. The catgut wire, stretched taut, could produce a high-pitched, terrifying shriek when plucked. The whistles, blown simultaneously, could mimic a desperate multi-toned human wail. The noise was designed to draw attention, but by the time anyone arrived, the sound source was gone, and the perfect silent body was left behind. The truth was a deeper terror. Finch hadn't just murdered people. He had murdered the sanity of the community by orchestrating the very sound of their fear. He controlled the victims, the location, and even the soundscape of the crime. Vance stood at the designated spot for the third killing, the anchor point. Finch's plan was clear: stage the scream, kill the sheriff, leave the body as the final, absolute proof of his geometry, and disappear. Finch hadn't merely solved the mystery of the Cottonfield scream killers, he had engineered it. Detective Vance sat across from D. Finch in the small, stuffy sheriff's office, the air thick with tension, despite the killer's utter lack of remorse or fear. Finch was calm, almost bored, as if the reality of his confinement was a temporary, minor inconvenience. "You understand you are facing execution, Finch," Vance said, leaning forward. Finch adjusted the fit of his borrowed prison uniform. The only sign of his discomfort was his inability to correct the disorder of the ill-fitting clothes. "Execution, Detective. A necessary removal of a flawed component, but it does not negate the perfection of my work." Vance placed the wooden box containing the whistles and the catgut wire on the table. "The screams, Finch. You didn't just kill them. You orchestrated the sound of their death. Why the theatricality?" "The aesthetic of the terror," Finch explained, his tone a detached lecture. "The visual evidence of death is transient. The auditory evidence of absolute despair remains in the minds of the witnesses. It is the lasting imprint, the memory that enforces the new order. I needed them to know the chaos was heard before the silence was imposed. You targeted Jesse and Caleb because they were noise," Vance stated. "But you didn't know them. Their lives had no impact on your professional failure." But they did," Finch said, a flicker of something close to passion entering his cold eyes. "The failures of the Delta are structural. These men represented the imprecise element. They farmed haphazardly, built structures on unstable ground, and ignored the historical floodlines. They were variables that defied the immutable laws of geometry and elevation. Their very existence was a disruption." Vance pushed the small, faded photograph across the table. Finch and the stern older man. "Your father, I presume. The man who taught you precision." Finch's expression tightened for the first time. "My father demanded perfection. He taught me the beauty of the straight line. But he could never achieve it himself. He allowed for human error. He died believing his work was flawed. And you are correcting his flaws. I am perfecting his vision," Finch stated simply. "I am creating the unassailable line, the straightest path between 2 points. The line where the noise is silenced." Vance understood the deep psychological root of the crimes. Finch was not just correcting the land, he was desperately trying to validate himself in the eyes of his dead, demanding father by creating a perfect, terrible masterpiece of order. "There is something else, Finch," Vance continued, lowering his voice. "The symbols, the caliper, the segmented circle. You called them the signature of the craftsman. Were they simply a boast of your precision?" Finch smiled, a look of genuine pride. "They were the proof of the method, but there was one more symbol, Detective. One that you missed at the first scene. A subtle indentation." Vance's mind raced back to the O'Connell land, the disturbed earth, the impressions he had found. A small, deep score mark. "Precisely," Finch interrupted, his eyes gleaming. "The mark of the plumb bob, the instrument that ensures the absolute vertical. It was the symbol of my moral elevation above the chaos." The final detail in the composition. Vance had been so focused on the lateral geometry of the map that he had missed the vertical declaration of the killer's warped superiority. The conversation had become a duel of psychological control. Finch was providing the details not out of guilt, but to ensure his work was fully understood and appreciated for its logic. "Finch," Vance concluded, standing up, his tone flat, "your geometry is flawed. A straight line is useless if the starting points are derived from madness. You chose to target human beings, and that is not precision. It's just murder." Finch sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. "You still do not grasp the scale, detective. The line will remain. I have shown the parish what happens when the rules are ignored." As Vance left the cell, the sheriff's face was grim. "He's mad as a hatter, Vance, but he's calm. That's the scariest part. It's like arguing with a stone wall." Vance looked back at the cell, knowing the terror Finch unleashed was far from over. The real danger now was that the seed of his logic, the fear of arbitrary, cold calculation, would remain, haunting the fields long after he was gone. Vance looked directly into the camera. The line of the killer's madness has been revealed, but the fear he created is still spreading. If you find this chilling, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Hit like and share your theories on the psychology of D. Finch in the comments. We have 3 more chapters to uncover the final repercussions of his perfect geometry. The case of the Cottonfield scream killers was physically closed, but the psychological cleanup was just beginning, and Vance knew the Delta would never look the same. With D. Finch incarcerated, a suffocating quiet descended upon Gravely Parish. The residents, forced to confront the chilling, rational nature of the crimes, found their sense of community irrevocably shattered. The killer had not been a random monster, but a man driven by a profound, cold belief in order, operating with instruments of precision. Detective Vance, though eager to leave the oppressive heat and return to New Orleans, felt a professional obligation to ensure the case was absolutely airtight, and more importantly, to help the community move past the psychological hurdle Finch had created. He met with local community leaders, the general store owner, Martha, and the pastor of the small surviving church. "They're afraid to go back to the fields," Martha admitted, twisting her hands. "Not because they think he's still out there, but because they keep looking for the lines. They look at a crop and think, am I standing on the wrong side of a boundary? Am I a piece of noise he would have silenced?" The fear had mutated from a fear of a madman to a fear of reason itself. Vance realized that Finch's true masterpiece was the collective psychological trauma. He hadn't just killed 2 men, he had weaponized the local geography and historical tensions of the Delta. "The best way to fight a false line is to draw a real one," Vance told them. "Finch used the land as a weapon. We must use the truth as a defense." He proposed a simple, powerful action, bringing the community to the 2 murder sites and publicly demonstrating the deception of the screams. A small crowd gathered at the O'Connell farm. The air was tense, but the curiosity was stronger than the fear. Vance stood where Jesse's body had been found, the cotton rows stretching around them like silent, accusing witnesses. He pulled out the crudely fashioned whistles and the catgut wire from Finch's evidence box. D. Finch was obsessed with perfection, Vance explained, his voice projecting clearly. But his most terrifying weapon, the scream, was a lie. It was an auditory illusion designed to maximize your fear and control your movements. He then demonstrated. He used the catgut wire stretched between 2 stakes and plucked it, producing a high-pitched metallic shriek that immediately silenced the crowd. He then blew the whistles, creating a multi-toned, unnerving wail that, in the deepening silence of the field, sounded remarkably like a desperate human cry. The demonstration had an immediate, profound effect. The terror was replaced by a wave of anger and humiliation. They weren't horrified by the supernatural. They were enraged by the manipulation. "He mocked us," someone muttered from the back of the crowd. "He made us fear a sound that wasn't even real." "That's right," Vance affirmed. "He was a fraud. His geometry was a mask for a man who failed his profession and sought revenge on the world. He didn't have power. He had a set of tools and a deeply broken mind. The act of revealing the trick broke the spell. The psychological terror began to recede, replaced by a solid, tangible anger directed at the man who had played them." Later that evening, Sheriff Dale brought Vance the final piece of documentation: Finch's birth certificate and medical records. Vance paused over a particular line in the early medical history. "Sheriff, look here. Finch was born with a minor but noted auditory hypersensitivity." "What does that mean, detective?" "It means he was easily overwhelmed by noise," Vance explained, a final dark piece of the puzzle clicking into place. His obsession with silence and order wasn't just philosophical. It was a desperate attempt to control an environment that was physically painful to him. The screams were his way of taking the pain he suffered from noise and inflicting it back on the source of what he perceived as disorder, the loud, messy vitality of the community. Finch hadn't just killed to satisfy a line. He had killed to achieve a physical, self-serving silence. The resolution was complete, but the moral weight of the case lingered. The terrifying realization that the most meticulous and calculated horrors are often rooted in the most authentic and deep-seated human weaknesses. Vance prepared to leave, understanding that while the killer was contained, the Delta would forever be a place where the sound of the wind in the cotton could easily be mistaken for a scream. The day of Detective Vance's departure, the atmosphere in Gravely Parish was subdued. The community had begun the slow, arduous process of recovery. The fear of D. Finch's arbitrary lines slowly being replaced by the grounded reality of his cold-blooded deceit. The fields were still vast and isolated, but the sound of the wind was just the wind, not a precursor to terror. Vance was packing his small suitcase in his rented room, folding his city-tailored clothes, when Sheriff Dale knocked on the door. The sheriff looked older, the stress of the case having taken a permanent toll. "Vance," the sheriff said, his voice low. "The folks are trying to move on. We've got the trial coming up, and I know he'll get what's coming to him. But there's one thing that keeps nagging at me. Something Finch said during the processing." "What did he say, Sheriff?" "He asked about the O'Connells, specifically the old, gnarled oak tree on their property. He asked if it was still standing." Vance frowned. He remembered the tree, an ancient, twisted landmark near the O'Connells' cabin, far from the Cottonfield where Jesse was murdered. "It's a landmark, Sheriff. It's on every old map. What's the significance?" Finch told the deputy it was the absolute reference point of his geometry. Not the 3 murders, not the elevation line. That tree. He said, "Every calculation is a departure from that route." The deputy thought he was just raving. Vance stopped packing. Finch was a man of absolute precision. He didn't say things casually. If the oak tree was the absolute reference point, then the map Vance found in the cabin, the map detailing the elevation line and the 3 anchors, was incomplete. "Get your rifle, Sheriff," Vance commanded, grabbing his hat. "We're going to the O'Connell place, now." They drove quickly, the dust once again boiling up behind them. At the O'Connell farm, Vance walked straight past the cabin and toward the massive, centuries-old oak. Its roots, thick as pythons, seemed to grip the earth with a fierce, ancient tenacity. Vance knelt at the base of the trunk, running his hands over the bark. He wasn't looking for a symbol. He was looking for a line. On the north side of the tree, barely visible, protected by the thick roots, he found it. A single thin line of chisel marks cut into the bark, running from the ground up to about knee height. It was a precise, measured cut, almost invisible beneath the grime. The initial reading, Vance stated, recognizing the meticulous work. Finch didn't start his geometry with the murders. He started here. He used this tree as his 0 point, his origin. But why was this important now? The killer was caught. Vance pulled out the map from Finch's satchel again, laying it against the root. The red line marking the killings was based on the 10-foot elevation contour. Finch's journal spoke of his father's flaw, the acceptance of human error. Vance suddenly realized the horrifying scale of Finch's true plan, a plan that went beyond the 3 anchor points. "The map, Sheriff, is not a record of his past kills," Vance said, his voice grim. "It's a prophecy." Finch was defining the boundary for the area he intended to cleanse. Vance pointed at the elevation line on the map. The line didn't end at Three Forks Bend. It continued, snaking along the bayou, encompassing every small farm, every cluster of shacks, for miles downriver. The 3 murders were just the proof of concept, Vance concluded, the truth a bitter realization. He used the first 3 to prove his method was viable, to terrorize the community into paralysis, and to validate his perfect line. His ultimate goal wasn't just 3 murders, it was to use this map to systematically wipe out every disorderly dwelling along the entire elevation boundary, a wholesale geometric purge. The oak tree was the genesis of a plan far grander and more terrifying than a simple serial killing. It was the blueprint for a rural massacre driven by a psychotic adherence to topographical maps. Vance and the sheriff spent the next 2 hours scraping, digging, and examining the area around the oak. Near a protruding root, they found a small, clay-covered glass jar, a makeshift time capsule. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a smaller, more intricate map, a highly detailed hand-drawn map of the Bayou St. Clair area, dated 2 years prior. This map belonged to Finch's father. The father's map showed the same elevation line, but his line was dotted, marked with the notation, "Caution, unstable ground, prone to human error." Finch had taken his father's cautious, non-binding line and made it his own immutable, deadly boundary. Vance finally understood the chilling logic. Finch hadn't just used the delta for his revenge. He used it to finish his father's unfinished, flawed work. The 3 victims were only the first equation in a never-ending problem of human disorder. The discovery was a critical piece of evidence for the trial, proving not just premeditation, but the vast, systematic scope of his psychological pathology. Vance realized that arresting Finch when they did was not just a successful capture. It was an accidental interruption of a catastrophic plan. They had stopped the Cottonfield purge on its 3rd, most volatile step. Detective Elias Vance stood on the train platform, the dust feeling lighter today, the air cooler, as if the confinement of D. Finch had literally lifted the oppressive atmosphere from Gravely Parish. The air, though still thick with humidity, no longer felt thick with fear. The trial of the Cottonfield scream killer was slated to begin in the parish seat within the month. The evidence, the maps, the obsessively detailed journal, the instruments of calculated death, and the discovery of the absolute reference point at the oak tree was irrefutable, painting the portrait of a systematic, terror-driven plot. Sheriff Dale, looking deeply worn but strangely resolute, stood beside Vance. The sheriff's face carried the permanent etching of the secrets he had uncovered. Secrets that bound the land and its people in a frightening geometric pattern. "You saved this parish, Vance," the sheriff said, removing his broad-brimmed hat and wiping his brow one last time with a clean handkerchief, a small, subconscious sign of the cleanliness Vance's presence had brought. Not just from a killer, but from a kind of madness we couldn't even see coming. The people understand now. They're rebuilding slowly. They're helping each other mark out their own safe lines, away from Finch's sick geometry. Vance nodded, his gaze distant, focused on the railway lines running straight toward the horizon. The healing process, he knew, was a long road fraught with doubt. The psychological trauma of being marked as noise by a methodical madman would linger, turning every unexplained shadow and every slight deviation in a cotton row into a potential anxiety attack. The fields, the very symbols of their survival, would forever carry the silent memory of the screams. "The work is done here, Sheriff," Vance replied, his tone low and reflective. He felt the heavy relief of the resolution, yet the lingering psychological residue of facing such calculated evil. Finch's terror was rooted in a very human need for control and validation. His perfection was just a mask for a deep-seated fear of imperfection and his professional failure. That's a lesson this parish needs to hold on to. The monster wasn't supernatural. He was just a broken man with a flawed ruler. Vance turned to him, offering a handshake, a gesture that had been stiff and formal upon arrival, but was now imbued with mutual respect forged in shared peril. "Thank you for the support, Sheriff. You navigated this mess with honesty and courage, even when the final target was yourself. And thank you for showing me that a mystery isn't always about what you see," the sheriff responded, gripping Vance's hand firmly, his eyes holding a new, cautious wisdom. "Sometimes it's about the space between the lines." As the train's whistle blew, a familiar, loud, comforting sound that was defiantly not a manufactured shriek, Vance stepped aboard. He settled into the compartment, the familiar rocking motion providing a steady rhythm after the frantic pace of the investigation. The window offered a final panoramic view of the Delta. He opened his notebook one last time. On the final page, he didn't write about Finch's expected sentence, which in 1907 Louisiana would likely be death by hanging for such a heinous, highly publicized crime. Instead, he sought to document the true internal consequence of the case. Final entry, Gravely Parish, 1907. The capture of Daniel Finch proves that the ultimate evil does not require the invocation of demons or ghosts. It only requires malignant certainty. Finch took the essential truth of this region, its instability, its changing boundaries, its dependence on the floodlines, and made it his moral justification for murder. He weaponized topography. He convinced this community to fear the very land they depend on. The revelation that the terrifying screams were nothing more than manufactured sound, a meticulously engineered illusion using hunter's tools and catgut wire, served a dual purpose. It broke the psychological hold of the supernatural, replacing it with the equally profound horror of human coldness. The townsfolk were humiliated that they were so easily manipulated, a rage that will serve them better than paralyzing fear. The discovery of the oak tree reference point confirmed the true horror. The 3 murders were merely the calibration for a systematic purge. They had not stopped a serial killer. They had interrupted the opening phase of a geographically determined massacre. Finch's plan was to enforce his deceased father's perfect line, creating an absolute boundary that would condemn every person whose dwelling lay on the unstable, disorderly side of the 10-foot elevation mark. "I leave Gravely Parish knowing that while the killer is contained, the scars are not physical, but geometric. The people here will survive, but they will never again look at a map, a piece of string, or a perfectly straight row of cotton without asking, whose line is this, and what does it demand?" The truest terror is not the monster that appears, but the man who calculates. The man who makes the arbitrary laws of a broken mind the final arbiter of life and death. The geometry of trauma remains, a permanent, invisible scar on the landscape of the Delta. Vance closed the notebook with a decisive snap, placing it in his satchel. He knew he would carry the memory of the Delta dust and the chilling, reasoned calm of D. Finch back to the city, his own internal geometry subtly shifted by the encounter. The final, profound psychological mystery was resolved, the horrifying logic of the killer exposed to the clear, indifferent light of day. The silence that followed was earned, deep and terribly real.